Welcome back. In this particular Unit 3, Section 3, Unit 3.3, we'll talk about how we move from behaviorism to cognitive psychology. Just to show you visually, what we're going to do is we'll talk about how behaviorism was born and how people moved from behaviorism to cognitive psychology and what specifically led to the emergence of cognitive psychology. And we're going to do that in the following slides. So the outcomes for this particular video include to talk about how behaviorism was born, to talk about how the transition was from behaviorism to cognitive psychology. Well, let's start with the first outcome, birth of behaviorism. The reason why there was behavior in the first place has to do with opposition to structuralism. Structuralism had some problems at that time. The first was the idea that it was subjective introspection. The methodology that structuralists used was introspection, which was subjective. And also related to it was the idea that it's not possible or not scientific to study something you can't see. So it was not objective like physics was. And at that time, the whole scientific field, including the newly born psychology, was envy of physics, and every other field was trying to emulate physics at that time. So that was problems with structuralism was one reason for the birth of psychology. The other one was that the alternative to structuralism were several, but behaviorism was the best possible available alternative at that point. Behaviorism had everything at that time that psychologists were looking at, especially thinking of a field that would be a model of in line with hard sciences like physics. And actually, the learning models developed by behaviorists, Watson and Skinner, were actually successful and popular. Especially the operant conditioning and classical conditioning learning principles were very popular. And these are the perfect soil for a new field to emerge. And the behaviorism had all the important characteristics to survive. Then in the next slide, we'll talk about what happened then. What led to the laws of behaviorism, why people moved away from behaviorism. And we'll start talking about that in the next slide. Well, if Watson is the reason for the birth of behaviorism, Skinner is the reason for not only popularizing behaviorism, but we can say for the immediate cause of loss of it. The reason is this, as we discussed earlier, Skinner popularized through Skinner methods, Skinner box, he modeled the learning through operant conditioning, and here impacted even policy, educational policies at that point. But it also became a reason why there was a need or there was a fight against behaviorism at that point. And the reason was his book, Verbal Behavior. 1957, Skinner published a book. He tried to explain human learning in general so far through rewards and punishments. This upset someone, and he wrote a review of it in 1959, suggesting that this book has no scientific information. It's a mumbo jumbo, just to use some words, and you cannot explain a complex human mental faculty like language acquisition through rewards and punishment. And that review of who was the one who wrote the review again? You remember that? That's right. Yeah, you're right. It's Chomsky. And that review came to be known as the Cognitive Manifesto because it laid foundation to the idea of studying something that you can't see. So you can see how language and cognitive psychology have these common roots here, or psycholinguistic and cognitive psychology. Well, now that we know how behaviorism was born and how it kind of uh, took over the psychology, then we looked at 1957 book, and now we're going to talk about the transition from behaviorism to cognitive psychology. Well, if 1913 is the birth year of behaviorism, 1960 is the birth year of cognitive psychology. 1957 book by Chomsky in 1959 is one that laid foundation to cognitive psychology, but the transition was not that late though, and was not that sudden that something happened in 59 and cognitive psychology was born in overnight in a year. No, that was not the reason. The transition was gradual. In fact, even before there was behaviorism in 1913, in early 1900s, people were working on other alternatives to structuralism. but not other perspectives because of its appeal through successful models. So at that time, we say the transition was very gradual. It was happening when behaviorism was at its peak also, because there were other fields of psychology, like clinical, social, educational. And at that time, if you remember, there was Ebbinghaus and his memory research work that laid foundation to the eventually to cognitive psychology. There were other fields too, like Gestalt psychology in Germany. There was also Bartlett, and we'll study about Bartlett's work later when we talk about semantic memories and schemas. But there was other work that was related to mental processes like Bartlett's. And there were some behaviorists called neo-behaviorists who said and acknowledged that there are mental processes or there could be mental processes, but again, they're only intervening factors. We don't need to study them. So there was some kind of acknowledgement of the mental processes in even in the group of behaviors. So we're going to talk about each one of these things, but the idea is this: it was gradual. The transition was gradual. So we said the transition was gradual to psychology from behaviorism. But why was there transition in the first place? We'll talk about challenges to behaviorism, where the 1957 book and 59 review of the book are just few important events. There are several other things that happen, and we'll talk about what were those challenges that behaviorists were unable to tackle at that point, which eventually led to the emergence of cognitive psychology. And that's what we'll do in the next slide. So we said that the emergence of cognitive psychology, or the transition from behaviorism to cognitive psychology, was gradual from early 1900s from even before behaviorism was born to 1960. It was gradual, but there are some special events that happen around this time frame of 15 years, from 1945 to 1960. Several important things happen, and that's why this time period is often referred to as cognitive revolution. It's not that people marched and had this freedom fight of that sort. There was nothing like a actual social revolution. It was more like a change in people's thinking about what should be studied and how it should be studied. Change more around this time, and that's why this period is called cognitive revolution. And there are several important events happening around this time, but there are three most important ones that we'll talk about here that led to the emergence of cognitive psychology. Number one, World War II. Number two, research in verbal learning tradition. Number three, role of linguistics. So that's what we'll do, starting with World War II in the next slide. Well, World War II and psychology, it sounds counterintuitive, right? Well, just imagine at that time, World War II, people needed help. The soldiers especially needed practical help. Soldiers who were on the field, on the battle, fighting, needed help. And there were several scientists who wanted to help them. They needed help with problem solving. They needed help with attention. They needed help with decision making. They needed help with perception. And none of these constructs were in the repertoire of behaviorists. They were ineffective in helping or even understanding or describing the issues that soldiers needed help with on the battlefield. So what they did, the behaviorists and other researchers, they collaborated with other scientists like communication engineers, computer scientists, and learned some new constructs like information, signal, constructs like hardware, software, which help them conceptualize and think about human psychology differently. So instead of just thinking that you cannot study something that you can't see, they started thinking about hardware, software, and thinking about the idea of mind as a hardware and mental process as a software, and talking about information and signals. So when they went back to their institutes, they started doing research on these topics. So gradually, people started moving away from behaviorism. So one of the challenges behaviorism had was to help the soldiers. For instance, even look at the camouflage dress that was designed at that point to was based on these idea of camouflage, which was more of a mental construct, how you can make something not conspicuous and how you can blend, how you can make people perceive these things as part of the background, even though this is a not. So and people needed help with transmission of information. People needed help with computing stuff. People needed help with flying, and all those things needed mentalistic constructs, which behaviorism strictly stayed away from. Okay, so the other challenge to behaviorism has to do with the work of Ebbinghaus. If you remember, we talked about Ebbinghaus, father of memory research, who worked in late 1800s, like 1870s, 80s. But after that, there were some followers who continued his work in around this time, and they did some research and extended um, Ebbinghaus's work, and they moved away from nonsense syllables to actually using words. They started asking some non behavioristic questions. Like, I know memory research was not behavioristic, but at a basic level, they were measuring the behavior of how many recitals do you need to, how many fewer recitals do you need to remember to learn something second time, or things like those. But eventually they moved away from that and started using same methodology, but studying words, meaningful content, and asking um, more conceptual memory related questions, like the how is information organized in the memory, as opposed to how many times do you need to repeat something, because then now they're dealing with meaningful words. Eventually, this laid foundation to this line of research that followed Ebbinghaus's work is often referred to as the verbal learning tradition. This laid foundation to study human linguistics and how we process words, how we remember words, how we memorize stuff. This became a very important part of cognitive psychology, and that actually gave rise to some very beautiful experimental paradigms in studying higher mental faculties. So in that sense, it laid foundation to cognitive psychology. The third challenge to behaviorism was the review, and this is Chomsky. The review of Skinner's 1957 book, and the review was published in 59. In this review of the book, Chomsky uh, propose that language is too complex to explain using behavioristic, simple constructs of punishment and reinforcement. And he said that the book itself did not describe any aspect of language, but merely some words. He said that for us to explain how we learn language, we need to incorporate such constructs as mind and mental processes, because it's a very complex system and a very complex process. In fact, not anyone can learn language. Like, you cannot teach a dog language by reinforcement punishment. You need to have the ability to learn language. And that ability, he called it LAD, language acquisition device, which is human mind. We only have that faculty to actually learn language. And that review itself laid foundation, this 1959 review itself laid foundation to the idea of the need to study human mind and mental processes. And with the advent of computers, and with the advent of the idea of information signals, and the idea of hardware and software, it became apparent eventually that you can study something that you can't see. And that laid foundation. That's why this review laid foundation to cognitive psychology, and it's often referred to as the cognitive manifesto. Although 59 is not the year that is considered as the birth year of cognitive psychology, 1960 is, which we'll talk about why 1960 later. So, yep. These are the challenges to behaviorism. So these challenges eventually led to the emergence of cognitive psychology. Now, in the next few slides, we'll talk about how cognitive psychology has emerged. Although it was gradual, we'll go from the 15 years of cognitive evolution and zoom into the specific, like look at the last 5 years, like 1955 to 1960, and see what are the immediate events that happened before 1960 in the next few slides. Just to kind of remind you, 1879 is considered as the birth year of psychology in general, 1913 the birth year of behaviorism, and 1960 is the birth year of cognitive psychology. So we'll move on to this specific period of 55 and 60, last 5 years before the birth of cognitive psychology, and what happened. So there are several events that happened in and around 1960, as close away as 1955 or 1950. Let's last 5 to 10 years, there are several important things happened, which laid foundation to cognitive psychology. One was obviously 1959 review, Chomsky's review of 1957 book. But in 50s, there was also Cherry and Broadbent's work on attention and vigilance. When we'll discuss about this when we talk about the unit attention. But also around in 50s, there was this computer, and these computers gave rise to this idea of mind and brain, right? Just like there's hardware and software, and you can run programs on the hardware, and you need a software to do that, right? For instance, you have your Word is a software, and you type things in, but you have to develop a program called Word to let it behave like the way you want it to behave or the way it is behaving now. But you can't see that program itself. People write codes and programs to create this behavior called Word. So the idea is that you can't see the actual program, but you can manipulate the behavior. So the idea is that our mind is like a software that you cannot see, but you can still study it because you can write codes, and our brain is like the hardware. So these several changes happened post-war, if you remember. But there is one important event that kind of officially defined cognitive psychology as a field, and that happened in 1956 at a conference. And there the proposition was made that computers can simulate human mind, and we'll talk about this conference of 1956 in the next slide. So at this conference um, of artificial intelligence, there was a symposium on the second day, and on the September 11th of 1956, on the second day, there were three important presentations given related to the symposium on cognitive science, and there were these three presentations. And that's why 1956 year and that date is considered as the day when cognitive psychology was officially announced as a, a scientific field or as a field by itself. And the three presentations are Newell and Simon's logic theory machine, Chomsky's transformational grammar, and Miller's magic number plus or minus 2. And the Newell and Simon's idea of logic theory machine, the idea was that and any intelligently behaving system are similar. In other words, any two systems that behave intelligently, including computers and humans, they do so because they have the capacity to store and to manipulate symbols. Symbol, as we discussed in talked about when we talked about language, is something that represents something else. And computers work intelligently because they store the information in the form of signals. Everything that the computers we have now, they store in the form of binary codes, 0110. So if it's Dundotker, my name, it may be stored as D as 0110, A as 10, 010, N as something something. So my name itself is represented in the form of zeros and ones. And when you give a specific instruction, it can manipulate those symbols. And the computer behaves intelligently because it stores and manipulates symbols. They said that it also applies to humans. Humans can also be imagined to actually intelligent because they have the capacity to store and manipulate symbols. In fact, they said that we can simulate what happens human mind by writing programs about it in computers. That's why this is a part of the artificial intelligence conference. So that was the important idea, comparing humans to computers and creating mental programs that would simulate human mind, suggesting that you can actually study objectively mental processes. Then Chomsky presented transformational grammar, and transformational grammar, we'll talk more about it later, but we kind of touched on that when we looked at topics in language and propositions. So transformational grammar is this idea that information can be stored at two different levels. Remember the surface level and the text-based level, right? Surface level is the surface structure of the information. For instance, you can say the boy hit the girl, okay? But that's the surface structure of it. In other words, it carries the meaning of the boy hitting the girl, and it also holds a meaning of it. But the same information can be said in multiple ways. So the girl was hit by the boy hit the girl, and so on and so forth. These are all different surface level syntactic structures. All these things can be represented in one propositional format. Does it make sense? The same sentence, the boy hit the girl or the girl was hit by the boy, These two sentences, they have the same propositional structure. And this idea was transformational grammar. Then Miller proposed this idea of mental processes specific to short-term memory. He said that humans can remember on average 7 items, not more than on average 7 plus or minus 2. So magic number 7 plus or minus 2. On average, humans remember 7 items, somewhere between 5 and 9 plus or minus 2. That is related to our short-term memory capacity. This is how much of information we can hold and manipulate in our short-term memory at any given point of time. These three presentations on that particular day laid cognitive psychology as a scientific field. So in the next slide, we'll talk about if these many things happened around these time, 55 to 60, why 1960 in particular considered as the psychology's birth year? And that's what we'll talk about in the next slide. So we said cognitive psychology emerged gradually, but why 1960 is the year of the psychology's birth then? Well, there are several most important things happened around this time. And they are, number one, there was a sudden rise in publications. Sudden rise in publication in 1960s specific to mental processes, memory, attention, and things of those decision making. The number of publications on these topics raised. Next is that Miller, Galanterm, and Peabram, they published a book, Plan and the Structure of Behavior, which was based off of the important presentations given at that particular conference, which is related to mental processes. Then the same year, a Center for Cognitive Studies was established at Harvard by Miller and his colleagues. These three important events happened in 1960, and these important events are related to the idea of cognitive psychology. So 1960 is considered as the year of birth of cognitive psychology. Okay, so what is cognitive psychology then? Well, cognitive psychology deals with mind and mental process. We study cognition and memory. You already know that, right? Well, the basic assumptions are the same, that mental processes exist. We can study mental process objectively, and we humans, like any other intelligent system, is so intelligent because we are information processing systems. We process information because we can store and manipulate symbols. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this particular unit, History of Psychology. I hope you liked it. Stay tuned and have fun learning. Thank you.